Hello, welcome to The Politics of Fiction. I'm Darren. On this channel I look at literature through a political lens, examining the themes, the worldview, the ideology of works of fiction. If you'd like to know a bit more about the channel, you can have a look at the little intro video on my YouTube page. That will give you more information, including about my Patreon page, where I've just posted the first video about a Mark Twain book. For the moment, there's going to be one Patreon video for every one YouTube video, so you can check that out if you like. So today I'm talking about The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Guin. See, I've even got the book here beside me to prove that I read it. But I'm not going to hold it here for the whole video like some booktubers do, because my arm will get tired, and I assume you all possess rudimentary object permanence, so I'm just going to leave it over here. I'll do a quick review of the book, and then later we'll get into the themes and the politics and the ideas. So let's get started. The Left Hand of Darkness is a masterpiece of speculative fiction and just a wonderful, beautiful, life-affirming piece of art that will stay with me forever. It's transgressive, it's subversive, it's revolutionary. This is the kind of book that changes something about you, or adds something to your experience, or reveals something latent that you weren't aware of previously. Thought-provoking is a word that we use a lot about literature, but here it's really an understatement. The book definitely sparks critical thought on an intellectual level, but more than that, for me at least, it provoked a profound emotional reaction, and I was left with a very satisfying, if melancholy, feeling of catharsis when I finished it. Le Guin has this way of writing that makes it feel like she is revealing the secrets of the universe to you through her elegant and ethereal prose. She'll take a concept like love or darkness or communication, and she'll describe it in a way that you will feel has always been on the tip of your tongue, but you weren't quite able to express. And then at other times she'll elucidate an idea in a way that you've never considered before. Her prose is consistently poetic in structure as well as in imagery. You get these lovely alliterative pairs sprinkled throughout the novel, like the sea slapped and sucked at the pilings, and some really nice assonance as well, the pallid bulks and hulks. Her descriptive imagery is sumptuous, ornate and lyrical, and then at other times it's stark and brutal and primal, a lot like nature itself. And the story is not really the centerpiece of the novel. It's overshadowed by the characters and the themes, which is often the kind of book that I'm drawn to. For me, character is always the most important element. A story is important, yes, but a story is something that should be driven by, or should happen to, the characters. In terms of characters, there's a really nice quote in the introduction to the book by David Mitchell. No, not that David Mitchell, the other one. I rarely read introductions to books, to be honest, because usually it's just some guy from Oxford with too many initials in his name waffling on for 17 pages and giving you the entire plot of the book. But for a book like this with so many great ideas, I was curious and I went back and read it after reading the book, and I do recommend it. I think it adds a lot to the experience. Mitchell says, "On Gethin we encounter tyrants, lovers, traitors, climbers of politics' greasy pole, refugees, convicts, children, landladies, bureaucrats and prison guards, all depicted with the ease and dignity of an old master, even those who exist only for a sentence or two." And I think that sums it up really well. Le Guin has a very humanist approach to her characters. You can tell that she really cares about them and their lives, similar to, I would say, people like Charles Dickens and Terry Pratchett. Mitchell also mentions that the main characters in the book are all flawed and muddled like us, and that's what makes them compelling and believable. One aspect I really enjoyed is that as you read, you realize it's almost more Estraven's story than Genly's, but crucially we get both of their perspectives. Le Guin's world building is subtle and effective. The world of Gethin is so vividly described geographically as well as societally. Even just the nickname of the planet is evocative, winter. The same as the Roman name for Ireland, incidentally. The book has a tangible sense of place. You can feel the cold air, you can hear the crunch of the snow underfoot and the cracking of the rotten ice. There are some myths and tales sprinkled in there too, which are narratively important, especially for the character of Estraven, but they also serve to flesh out the world and give us these little snippets of lore. So Le Guin definitely does not subscribe to what I call the Star Wars Encyclopedia school of world building. I had the Star Wars Encyclopedia as a kid. I got it for Christmas and I loved it. You open it up and it's just a picture of some extra standing in the background in Mos Eisley, and it's like, this is Haz Rumpo from the planet Gleep, and he's a smuggler. Sure, why not? Certain fantasy series and video games can be a little bit guilty of this, where this lore, divorced from the narrative or the characters really, is just foisted on you in massive info dumps. And I know that some fantasy and sci-fi fans really love that, just inhaling all this raw lore like it's spice from Arrakis or something. And it can be a lot of fun to dive deeply into the lore of something like Lord of the Rings or Warhammer or whatever. But Le Guin doesn't do that. She gives you the tip of the iceberg. And then for the rest, you have to use your imagination. You know, that thing we all used to have before smartphones? The language of the book serves the world building as well. We get these lovely idioms that aren't too clunky or intrusive as they are sometimes in these kind of books. For example, the glaciers didn't freeze overnight, or that's a lot of snow out of one cloud. That's very catty, I like that one. We also get some descriptions using the features of the world. His voice sounded thin, like the creaking of ice. Madeline Miller does something very similar to this, which I love, which is where the language and the descriptive imagery in particular reinforces the world building. If you read a Miller book, her similes and metaphors are all of the world. They're all comparing things to lyre strings or the deck of a ship and things like that. You get the world building seeping into the language of the book, making it completely immersive. Le Guin gives us glimpses of a world and a society and of people's lives that we can well imagine continuing after we've closed the book. I don't think this book is particularly difficult or inaccessible, but as you read it, you can definitely get a sense of the depth of it. It's dense with ideas, like a giant root system living under the narrative. Le Guin covers the human, the natural, the supernatural, the societal, the historical, the political, the scientific, the mythological. Everything is here expertly delineated and explored and imagined and intertwined. There is a profound exploration of the individual and the society woven throughout the book, always one to illustrate and to reflect the other. Which brings me on to the first subject, dualism. Now, this is maybe more a philosophical point than a political one, but I'll mention it first because this concept pervades everything else in the novel, and it's really the lens through which all of the other points are studied by Le Guin. Le Guin was a proponent of Taoism, and you'll find Taoist principles in a lot of her work. Now, this is not about a simple Manichaean good versus evil, it's more about balance in nature, light and darkness. There's a great line from the Earthsea books that comes to mind: to light a candle is to cast a shadow. In this book, the point is made that, yes, in complete darkness you can't see anything, but in complete light you can't see anything either. Both are necessary. The rather pretentious name that I came up with for these conceptual pairings that we see throughout the book, like light and darkness, is dialectical binaries. If that's too highfalutin for you, you can think of them as dueling banjos. It's basically the same principle. So these dialectical binaries are opposites, but they're not just opposite, they're also complementary and interdependent. Some of these are mentioned in the book, like shadow and unshadow, country and uncountry. Then we have dualities like masculine and feminine, like the two neighboring states, like the planet Gethin and the Ecumen, the community of planets, and even our two protagonists, Genli and Estraven. There are also dualisms that are absent from this world that we and Genli are familiar with: strong and weak, dominant and submissive. And of course, crucially, within the people themselves, within the Gethenians, we have this duality at work as well. This concept culminates in the poem which gives the book its title, Light is the Left Hand of Darkness. And then we get Genli drawing the yin-yang symbol to illustrate the idea, which is a little bit on the nose, but I'll forgive it because it's Ursula. And then we have this really lovely line from Genli to Estraven: light, dark, fear, courage, cold, warmth, female, male. It is yourself, Therum, both and one. a shadow on snow. Everything in the book is suffused with this idea of the one and the other and how they interact. Everything is mirrored, symbiotic, intermeshed. It's a bit like a Christopher Nolan script, except this book is actually well written, thematically rich, and emotionally resonant, as opposed to just being draped in the affectation of intellect. But Le Guin doesn't have Hans Zimmer, so... Let's move on to talk about the book's treatment of sex, gender, and the other. So firstly, just to mention that there were some criticisms leveled at Le Guin about this book, mostly by other feminist writers. One of the controversial things was her portrayal of the biological essentialism of that ambisexual nature of the Guithenians. Technically, in this book, Le Guin doesn't really explore gender as opposed to and distinct from sex. Others took issue with her use of the pronoun he throughout the book to refer to the Guithenians. I suppose textually it makes sense when Genli is speaking, maybe, but Le Guin herself later agreed with that criticism. And she later wrote a short story based on Gethin using she as the pronoun instead, although she always insisted that using they was too confusing. Obviously, in recent years, they has become much more commonplace. But ultimately, despite these issues, I think the book can still be read as an exploration of gender and non-binary identity. Charlie Jane Anders wrote the afterword to this book, and she has a really nice passage on this, which I'll read for you. It casts a reflection on all the fixed ideas in our own world. Maybe our rigid gender binary is just as made up as their neutral except once a month gender is. Maybe our government-issued pronouns and official stereotypes don't have to define us always. Especially for my fellow trans and non-binary people, a story that undermines the assumptions behind coercive labels feels magical. The main point here for me is the journey of empathy and understanding that Genli undergoes in the book. He has preconceptions about this strange group of people, but when he really gets to know one of them, what I like is that the conclusion is not as trite as, oh look, we're all human, we're all the same really. It's more about the differences between them, accepting and even celebrating those differences. From chapter 1, the Guithenians are set up not just as human but different, but rather as completely alien. Their biology, their society, their way of life, their way of speaking and acting. Genli, and we, through Genli, have this feeling not just of culture shock, but of complete context collapse. He really is floundering in this bizarre place, dealing with these inscrutable people, committing gaffes and trying to navigate misunderstandings. Personally, as I read the book, I couldn't help but picture the Guithenians as vaguely Nordic men, for the most part. Which goes to prove Le Guin's point, really. That our human instinct is to categorize people, to compare them to something that we already know and we already have experience of, instead of taking the time to discover them and maybe add a new category to our experience. Or forget about categories altogether. And that feeling made me identify with Genli from the outset. I think Genli is a very realistic character. He's not a horrible bigot, although he is clearly a misogynist who associates femininity with things like weakness and deviousness and other negative qualities. I think a lot of people at the moment in the world, especially people of a certain generation, are maybe struggling with what's happening with gender and identity and so on. It's not easy for everyone to parse this kind of deconstructionist period that we're going through. And that's okay. The important thing is to attempt to understand, to treat people with love and respect and compassion. If empathy is your starting point, then you won't go too far wrong. And Le Guin is all about empathy, humanity, consideration, compassion. The warmth radiates off the page, contrasting with this icy, inhospitable world in yet another dialectical binary. Our two protagonists are forced together in hardship as they cross the ice in what is the narrative and moral centerpiece of the novel. This is the culmination of Genli's inner journey of acceptance, the friendship and love that develops between them. And we get this beautiful realization from Genli. Until then, I had rejected him, refused him his own reality. I think that's such a resonant line for example, queer people, who often have to struggle just to have the fact of their existence acknowledged and accepted. So Genli and Estraven are fighting for their lives out on the ice. One is pushing, one is pulling, they're often having to move further away from their destination, and yet all the time they're getting closer as people. It's on the frozen expanse of ice that Genli's barriers finally melt away, out of the darkness of ignorance into the light of acceptance. Genli recognizes that he had othered Estraven, Gender, after all, can be a way to other people, to separate them, to categorize them. It's interesting that at the end, Genli sees the arriving humans, his colleagues, as a Guthenian would. He sees them as foreigners. He has opened himself up to this world and immersed himself in it. I think as a treatment of the other as a concept, there are multiple other ways in which this book could be read. You have concepts like feminism and race and xenophobia and the immigrant experience that you could read into this, but we don't have time to get into all of that. The main thing that I took away from it is that empathy leads to understanding, leads to acceptance. And I think the very least we can do for our fellow human beings is accept them for who they are. So let's talk about society, geography, and patriotism. So what kind of a society are we presented with on Gethin? One thing I found really interesting is how quaint and primitive and provincial everything is in the book. Normally, in science fiction, a gender study like this would be more common as the tale of a hyper-evolved race of beings who have moved past binary notions of sex and transcended to a higher plane. If you've seen Star Trek, you'll know this archetype. You have these aloof, androgynous beings who are usually like glowing for some reason, and they just talk really patronizingly to all these silly little livestock people with their dangling sex organs. That's not what we get on Gethin at all. This is more rough around the edges, more human. We get so many great little world-building details in the book. For example, the fact that on Gethin it's always year one. Past and future years change by one every year. That's a lovely touch of world building. And we have this nice line about the pace of life on Gethin. Terrans tend to feel they've got to get ahead, make progress. The people of Winter, who always live in the year one, feel that progress is less important than presence. These people live very much in the present, in the here and now. Another little detail that I liked is when Genli supposes that the taboo about speaking while eating is a survival instinct. And it's the same for the two of them when they're in the tent. If they want to survive, eating every last crumb is so important that you can't afford to be yapping away to each other. And then even minor details like temperature dials reading counterclockwise on Gethin, because freezing is the norm. The thought experiment that Le Guin explores here is not just what would a society of non-binary people look like, but also what if those people had to live on the planet Hoth from The Empire Strikes Back. The impact of the harshness of the climate leads to some wonderful insights, like the central role played by hospitality in the society. I've heard the argument made, for example, that Irish people value hospitality so much because we went through a famine. We know what penury and privation look like. On Gethin, generosity is essential because there's just not enough to go around to reward being a cheat or being selfish. Not only is it not socially desirable, but it's just not feasible. One of the questions asked by the investigator in the book is about the absence of war. Is that a product of having no men or of constantly having to battle the elements? It seems like geography influences these people just as much as, if not more than, their biology. Another question is, what would a society achieve if they weren't preoccupied by sex all the time? And maybe it is tempting to think of a society with increased efficiency without that distraction. But then again, what drives a lot of human behavior, art and culture and status and work and relationships? I think you can argue that both ways. And I like that we're not given any simple answers here by Le Guin, because a lot of complex factors go into shaping a society. In terms of the internal politics, there is a lot of politicking that goes on in the book. We have insane kings and backroom schemers and committee apparatchiks. There are a lot of quarrels and forays and assassinations. And we get this great line that illustrates this. An enemy in Carhide is not a stranger, an invader. The stranger who comes unknown is a guest. Your enemy is your neighbor. So we have these burgeoning nation states emerging, becoming more ambitious and more aggressive and squabbling. And we get another oppositional duality in the two nation states that we're presented with, Carhide and Orgarain. Orgareen? I'll go with Orgarain. Genli tries to navigate this political landscape and does it very badly. It's funny, when he arrives in Orgarain, in the neighbouring state, and he thinks, now this is better. These fellows seem to understand the importance of my mission. Then 5 minutes later, he's naked in the back of a truck being hauled off to a prison camp. Central to Guthenian society is the concept of Shifgrithor, which is a lovely, aggressively Scandinavian-sounding word. Genli attempts to define Shifgrithor as prestige, face, place, the pride relationship, the untranslatable and all-important principle of social authority. He's told later that it comes from the old word for shadow, and incidentally there are a lot of mentions of shadows in the book. To me this seems much like the Japanese idea of face, or at least the possibly Orientalist idea of it that we've absorbed in the West through cultural osmosis. This kind of aura of dignity and authority governed by an opaque code of etiquette, any breach of which results in embarrassment and even shame and, I guess, a loss of social capital. A social phenomenon like this could present itself in many different ways. It could be the kind of self-policing that people feel they need to do in strictly hierarchical or repressive societies. Or it could be kind of a binding system of honour that encourages fairness and equity. It really just depends. As an Irish person, I can't help but see things like this fairly negatively. To me, it seems a bit like that kind of small-town piety, something you display consciously and solemnly by going to church and abiding by norms, etc. I think there could exist a healthy collectivist version of this, basically just a loose moral code of community spirit coming from decency and compassion. I think Shifkrathor in the book is somewhere in between. Another major social pillar that we encounter is patriotism. And this idea comes up numerous times, that patriotism is based more on fear than on love. Xenophobia is something that Gethin has in abundance, although Genli has brought it with him as well. I think the most striking example of this fear that is at the root of patriotism is presented to us in the character of King Argavan. Now, Argavan is a little bit unbalanced, for sure, but he is perfectly conscious of the fact that not only does he rule through fear, but he is ruled by fear. There's no other way for a powerful leader to exist. He must be terrified of everything as a means of self-preservation, which leads to questions like, what is power? Is it just the appearance of power, the illusion of control? Every ruler in every society has always known that they and their palace guard and their soldiers and their police are outnumbered vastly by the people, and they're afraid. Good, they should be. Estraven has this really lovely passage where he talks about patriotism. How does one hate a country or love one? Taib talks about it. I lack the trick of it. I know people, I know towns, farms, hills and rivers and rocks. I know how the sun at sunset in autumn falls on the side of a certain ploughland in the hills. But what is the sense of giving a boundary to all that? Of giving it a name and ceasing to love where the name ceases to apply? What is love of one's country? Is it hate of one's own country? Then it's not a good thing. Is it simply self-love? That's a good thing, but one mustn't make a virtue of it or a profession. Insofar as I love life, I love the hills of the domain of Estre, but that sort of love does not have a boundary line of hate. And beyond that, I am ignorant, I hope. Which leads us on to our final point, loyalty, duty, and truth. Loyalty and betrayal is another duality that we're presented with in the book. What constitutes loyalty and what constitutes betrayal? Of course, as with all the binaries in the book, it's a bit more complicated than that, and there are a lot of conflicting loyalties here. This is all encapsulated really powerfully in the character of Estraven and in his actions. We have this label Estraven the traitor, both the old tale and the Estraven that we know. Speaking of traitors, we also have that funny scene of Genli with the king. Genli is ordered to talk to the guy on the other end of the Ansible, the long-range communication device, who has to answer on the spot the king's ridiculous philosophical question, what makes a man a traitor? You can just picture some developer type, the only one left in the office that day, frantically Googling, what makes a man a traitor? Reddit. Secrets and lies abound on Gethin. We have this line, secrecy in Carhide is to an extraordinary extent a matter of discretion, of an agreed, understood silence, an omission of questions, yet not an omission of answers. This is something we're very familiar with. It's a common feature of authoritarian societies, for example, this kind of constructed reality. And some people consider maintaining or going along with the lie to be their duty. Estraven, on the other hand, has a much broader view of duty, which involves a lot of sacrifice on his part. From the point of view of his planet and his state, he commits a number of grave crimes. The relationship with his brother, his dealings with Genli and the king, his stealing, his final act in the book. He abandons his Shifkrathor to serve a higher purpose, humanity. His exile from his home is contrasted with his world moving closer into the galactic community. These dark acts, as his people might see them, served to light their way into this new age. And that is really beautiful and very sad. Let's finish by talking about truth. The book is made up of a lot of different narrative elements. We have the hearth tales, which are the myths and stories of the world. We have the reports from Genli, who's the envoy, and from his predecessor, the investigator. And we have the journal entries from Estraven. So particularly with Genli and Estraven's chapters, we get this kind of metatextual point being made about truth and stories and communication. The idea that there is no one objective truth and that we need to get different perspectives to see the whole picture. We see how misunderstandings and deceptions can happen so easily, especially when trying to communicate cross-culturally. So again, we have these ideas of empathy and understanding, that we need to listen to one another to understand the other's point of view. We also get a few other nice details, like the fact that lying is impossible when using mind speech. There's a similar idea in The City in the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. So once you make that empathic, emotional connection with someone, there is no way to shroud that in artifice. You communicate freely and openly. That's a really nice idea. In true Taoist fashion, we'll end the discussion by going back to the beginning, to the book's opening lines. Truth is a matter of the imagination. The soundest fact may fail or prevail in the style of its telling. Like that singular organic jewel of our seas, which grows brighter as one woman wears it, and worn by another dulls and goes to dust. Facts are no more solid, coherent, round and real than pearls are, but both are sensitive. I don't need to launch into a rant on fake news or journalistic propaganda or the crushing of dissent or the denial of genocide or anything like that to show you how important this point is. You already know it. It reminded me of that great quote by Rosa Luxemburg. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Words to live by. So that's it for The Left Hand of Darkness. What a wonderful book. There are so many other ideas in there that we didn't even get time to touch on. If you made it this far through all my waffling, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to like, subscribe, leave a comment, that would be great. You can check out my Patreon if you want more content. And I hope to see you back here again soon. Thank you. Take care of yourselves.